This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour from Exclusive Scottish Visits, and welcome to my Letter from Scotland End of Year Roundup 2024. This is on the Unique Scotland podcast that brings you the latest news from this wonderful country that puts the great into Britain. This newsletter gives you an insight into what makes this tiny but beautiful country tick. And, of course, news can be generally depressing, so for this final Unique Scotland podcast for 2024, I'm going to focus only on the good news around Scotland, and do I have some wonderful stories for you to enjoy, especially from the previous guests who have travelled with me not only to discover long-lost relatives, but have met with local Scots who were connected in some way with their ancestors. So, I won't be mentioning, for example, past features of my Letter from Scotland podcasts, commenting on the political scandals that have, in recent times, surged through the Scottish Parliament. And I won't dwell on the never-ending ferry building disaster, which are 6.5 years late and 3 times over budget. But I will start this podcast with the good news on the ferries, in that I heard in a recent TV interview from the interim Chief Executive Officer of Caledonia McBrain, that's the ferry company by the way, that the delayed ferries will soon enter service, and you'll hear that commentary shortly. And I can report there's no more information to date, 31st of December 2024, on Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's ex-First Minister, who was arrested for alleged embezzlement, so we won't need to go there. One piece of good news from my previous Letter from Scotland podcast is that the escaped macaque monkey from the Highland Wildlife Centre, which was captured a few days later, has now been transferred to the Central Zoo in Edinburgh and is doing very well. Indeed, there's a suggestion of a love interest from a female macaque called Canny Wait, so watch this space. And on the topic of animals, I'll let you know what happened to the border collie sheepdog who had to have one of his legs amputated. End of career, perhaps into retirement? Well, listen in. Overall, it's going to be a Scottish good news bonanza, culminating in commentary from some of my guests on their amazing historical and genealogical finds during our tours of Scotland. Now, I know you're going to be blown away by some of these tales, such as the Wood family who actually met a cousin while visiting a museum during some of their research, or the Gill family who met a 90-year-old local villager, Roy Macintyre, at Altbea, who had seen their uncle, a merchant sailor who was shipwrecked in the area in 1944. Well, it's all here and much more, so sit back and enjoy this upbeat Letter from Scotland with John Harbour of Exclusive Scottish Visits on the Unique Scotland podcast. You heard it here first, probably. Great news. At last, getting away from all the depressing headlines of 2024, Unique Scotland's bringing you some brightness in all the gloom, and I will also share some of the enchanting stories from guests and tours this year. I want to start with my driving tours around Scotland in November with lovely clients from America. Now, I mention this because I normally stop driver guiding at the end of October at the latest, but I was asked to do a couple of tours later this year in November, and I decided to take them on. I have to say I was just a wee bit apprehensive because winter driving in the Highlands can be a little bit hazardous if the weather deteriorates. Well, I'm delighted to say I was proved wrong and the weather held out. I'm not saying it wasn't cold or that some snow hindered our progress occasionally, but overall, the absolute beauty of glens such as the Torridon Mountain Valley or the Balachnaba leading up to Applecross were breathtaking. So, good news for me, and further good news is that the Scottish Tourist Board, and they're called Visit Scotland, is actively encouraging travellers to make Scotland a winter destination. I've just been reading one of their brochures, and I note that they are actively promoting winter tourism. And I've seen the activities firsthand with winter festivals, especially around the cities, and you can see one of my reels on Facebook showing Edinburgh Christmas lights. There are also outdoor adventures and some excellent bargains for cosy escapes to some old Victorian hunting lodges or even the more prestigious hotels. For a recent weekend break for myself, my partner Pam and Minnie, our spaniel, I recently hired a lovely cottage in Auchterarder near Perth. It's called 5 Acre and is surrounded by beautiful farmland. The accommodation was superb, and the log fire made the winter break a real cosy getaway, and we were made extremely welcome by Alison and Andy Duggan, the owners of this delightful little gem. There are some lovely restaurants locally, for example Café Kiza, where Pam and I went for dinner. Great menu and super service. And even at this time of year, you'll find some local outdoor adventures with quad bikes, clay pigeon shooting, or just walking the numerous paths around the Perthshire countryside. Oh, and don't forget the dark skies and northern lights, or the aurora borealis, to look out for at this time of year. So folks, good news is that Scotland remains open for business throughout the year. So I hear you ask, what's the good news about the ferries being built by Ferguson Marine at Port Glasgow, which are already 6.5 years late and 3 times over budget? Well, it's now hoped that the first one, the Glen Sannox, will enter service shortly. Now, if you are visiting Scotland on holiday, then this will affect you if you intend visiting one of the outer or inner Hebridean islands, because ferry availability will be crucial to your holiday experience. Thus, my happiness, albeit with fingers crossed, at the prospect of the new ferries coming into service. Anyway, Mr. Duncan Mackison, the interim chief executive of Caledonia McBrain, the Scottish ferry operator, was interviewed by Alistair Dalton, the transport correspondent from the Scotsman newspaper. Alistair repeated that the people of Scotland have been waiting for over 6 years for these ferries, and he asked how confident was he, Mr. Mackison, that they were going to enter service in the next few months. Well, here's his reply.
We're now involved in the closing stages of the build. I'm involved in weekly calls about how that's going to be completed. We have teams, we have a master and a chief engineer and other members of our team working at the yard full time, and we've seen the results of the trials that have started to take place. So we are confident that it's coming towards us in the next month or two.
Interesting reply. Well, I think you can see why I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I have to say I wasn't totally convinced by the response, but it's still good news, or better news than we've had for quite a few years now. Well, the next good news story might bring a tear to your eye, and it refers to a lovely border collie sheepdog named Boss. Now, he was working on a farm in Perthshire where he went missing in the hills, and after an extensive search by locals and even drones, the poor dog could not be found. His owner, shepherdess Anna McKinnon, was distraught, and after a week decided that Boss would not be back. However, one day later, he limped into the farm and lay down beside Anna and was clearly in some distress. On checking Boss's front leg, it was clear that he'd had a serious injury, and the vet was called. Boss was subjected to over 5 weeks of vet consultations and, of course, family prayers in the hope that the wee border collie would recover. Well, sadly, he did not fully recover, and Anna had to make the difficult decision to allow the doctors to amputate Boss's leg, and although it was a hugely difficult decision to make, they knew that it was a kindness to their working dog, even if a 3-legged sheepdog would not be of much use. Well, I'm delighted to report that straight after surgery and after the anaesthesia had worn off, Boss was ready to get outside and run around. And more importantly, a few weeks after his stitches were taken out, he was back at work chasing sheep, happy and excited to get back out there. The latest report is that even after losing a leg, Boss remains highly active, and Anna has been quoted as saying that not much has changed. So well done to Boss, and well done to Anna. Just before I go on to the next story, I have another tale of a border collie, and this is on Lailt Farm near Kingussie, where I often take guests to watch sheepdog demonstrations. On one such visit, I noticed one of the collies staying very close to Ian the shepherd, and then he explained that his dog was blind, which stunned us all. However, this dog had been one of his best sheepdogs, and he refused to part with him. Then, all of a sudden, with the call of a whistle, Ian set Jess, his blind sheepdog, down the field towards a flock of sheep. The dog took off at speed and in a straight line, heading right for the sheep at the end of the field. There were a couple of commands from Ian to keep the collie in a straight line, but then the command stopped as the dog got scent of the sheep and went into auto to bring them back to his master. It was a magnificent display of professionalism and dogged determination to see this blind sheepdog perform in such a way. And Ian explained to us all later that although the dog was blind, he understood and followed the whistle calls left and right until he was within scent of the flock, and then his natural instinct kicked in to bring the sheep back to the start. I found it absolutely amazing to watch. Now, these stories are not only great news, but also great lessons for all of us in persevering through the most difficult times, regardless of what life throws at you. The next story is about an American couple, tourists Paul and Amanda Reisel from Orlando, who planned to get married in Scotland, but their trip from Florida was plagued by multiple delays, cancellations and even lost luggage, leaving them to arrive on the Isle of Skye at 11 p.m. the night before their wedding with only their wedding rings. Now, the problem started for the couple from Orlando, Florida, when their flight to the UK was diverted to Philadelphia. This then led to a series of knock-on delays to their 4,000-mile journey that included stops in London, Heathrow and Inverness. Now, this poor couple ended up spending a total of 3 days stuck at airports, and to add insult to injury, their luggage disappeared along the way. Well, step up to the mark Isle of Skye wedding photographer Rosie Woodhouse, who posted an appeal on a local website to the locals of Skye. The islanders heard the appeal and rallied to save the American couple's wedding day after their disastrous journey. Within 12 hours, Paul had been presented with a full kilt outfit, and more importantly, Amanda had been presented with a fabulous wedding dress thanks to the kindness and generosity of a Broadford primary school teacher, Teresa. Transport was provided to ferry them to their humanist wedding location, and they were able to exchange vows in the most picturesque setting on the wonderful Isle of Skye. Not surprisingly, Amanda had been ready to give up and go home, but she said that Rosie and the community of Skye saved the day, turning a perfectly imperfect wedding into a momentous occasion that will stay with her for the rest of her life. And she was quoted as saying that the people of Skye will be famous in Orlando because we will tell anyone who will listen that they are the reason our love was cemented into a perfect wedding day. And I would like to add to that, well done to Rosie Woodhouse and the people of the island of Skye. Just returning for a moment to the animal theme, here's another good news story about an alpaca farm in Thornhill, and that's near the Stirling area of Scotland, which runs an alpaca trekking centre. It houses around 35 alpacas. You know, that's the animal that looks a bit like a camel, but it's only smaller. Well, this story is of hope after rejection, in that Annie the alpaca was rejected by her mother just after birth, and she would have perished if it was not for the intervention of the centre's owner, Danny Burns, who made arrangements for her to be bottle-fed every 2 hours. Now, Danny himself was well aware of abandonment, having lost his own job and livelihood, with little chance of working in the industry that he left. So he bought a couple of alpacas, and 14 years later, he now has 35 of them, as well as 10 staff, 3 Labradoodle dogs, owls, rabbits, ducks, chickens, geese, and other stragglers to his home of kindness. Well, I'm delighted to report that Annie the alpaca took to the human kindness and is now fully grown. The only thing is that having lived with 3 Labradoodles, she thinks that she's a dog and now joins the family in the car on trips. Indeed, the car had to be changed to accommodate her. Quite a family member having your own car bought for you. And you can imagine the surprise of other motorists seeing an alpaca sticking its head out of the car window. And even better news is that she's pregnant herself now, and Danny looks forward to a new addition to the alpaca family. This is a slightly more serious story, but a good news one nevertheless, in that it involves a German who was captured in France as a 19-year-old soldier during the Second World War. Now, what has this to do with Letter from Scotland, you might ask? Well, he was eventually transferred to Scotland and housed in a prisoner of war camp just outside the picturesque village of Cymru, about 25 miles west of the city of Perth. That camp was called Cultibragan, and although the guns have long since fallen silent, the camp can still be found nestling beneath the rugged Aberruchel Hills and alongside the water of Ruchil, a peaceful location with a fascinating history. The camp was constructed during the Second World War to house up to 4,000 prisoners. Firstly, there were Italians and then there were German prisoners of war. It was one of 2 high-security prisons in Scotland, and this was POW Camp 21. It had a notorious reputation for housing dozens of SS officers, members of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe and Marine Corps, among others. Well, this young 19-year-old prisoner of war was Heinrich Steinmeier, and he was held in the camp until 1944, when he was released and returned to Germany. During his time in Scotland, he was touched by the character of locals who treated him with kindness, which he never forgot. He might have stayed in Scotland, but he returned to his native Silesia, East Germany, to be with his elderly widowed mother, and later settled in Delmenhorst near Bremen. Well, Mr. Steinmeier sadly died recently, and, as a mark of thanks and gratitude for the kindness he was shown during his internment, he has left his entire estate, valued at nearly £400,000, to the Scottish village of Cymru to help its elderly people. The Cymru Development Trust will use some of the money to help restore 11 of the Nissen huts at Cultibragan Camp and upgrade the tourist visitor facilities. It's a fascinating piece of Scotland's wartime history, and you can learn more of the story by visiting the camp, its museum, and some of the huts that used to house some of the notorious prisoners. In the end, Heinrich Steinmeier did return to his old camp, as his ashes were brought over from Germany and were scattered in the hills near to Cultibragan. And remaining on the theme of prisons, and another animal tale as it happens, this is about the one-eyed cat who went missing for 5 years from his residence, which happened to be His Majesty's Prison, Grampian in Peterhead, about 30 miles north of Aberdeen. Now, this cat was a resident of the prison, and he was much loved by the staff, who called him One-Eyed Joe and made sure that he was fed and watered regularly. He did stray one day to the local port, about 2 miles away, and by mistake he was locked in a metal container bound for an offshore oil rig. Well, the prison officers were distraught when One-Eyed Joe went missing, and after a few weeks gave up on ever seeing him again. It was 5 years later that the prison warders received a call from the Society for the Protection of Animals to say they'd found a cat with one eye, who they may have been looking for. Amazingly, it was One-Eyed Joe, who was returned to his original home to a hero's welcome. One prison officer was quoted as saying that he'd remained hopeful for Joe's eventual return, and he'd always kept an eye out for him. Well, a great news story indeed, and it was heartening to hear that during the 5 years' absence, Joe was adopted by the oil rig crew and was spoiled rotten by them as well. So his 5-year absence was not all that bad. Well, that's the general good news roundup, and I'd now like to share with you some amazing tales about guests who have joined me for a tour this year and whose stories are going to blow your mind. They're not only inspirational, but really heartwarming, where my guests were able to really connect with their past, and in so doing, were gobsmacked themselves with what they found. You'll recall from a previous podcast the Wood family, who were researching their own ancestry, and in particular the sinking of the fishing vessel Harmony in the 1881 Eyemouth fishing disaster. Mr. Wood's great-grandfather had perished in this vessel along with other relatives. On the day we visited the Eyemouth Museum, there was, by sheer chance, another gentleman visiting to do some research of his own on the Harmony fishing vessel. When I inquired as to what his connection was, he explained that he'd lost his great-grandfather in the Harmony. Incredibly, this man's great-grandfather was the brother of Mr. Wood's great-grandfather. An amazingly serendipitous moment to discover that these men, who lived thousands of miles apart, should meet on this spot at exactly this time, seeking out the same information. And they were cousins. Well, I'm pleased to say that they now remain in touch. My main story today is about Mr. and Mrs. Gill, who were on tour with me last month from an excellent agency that I work with called Dream Escapes, and they had happened to mention that their uncle had served in an American Liberty ship in the Second World War, and that he survived a shipwreck near Altbea. Now, I've visited Altbea many times, which is at the head of Loch Ewe, and you will know it, my regular podcast listeners, from my North Coast 500 series of podcasts. It's about halfway between Gairloch and Ullapool. This area was not on our original itinerary, so I asked the Gills if they'd like to try and see the spot where the ship went down, and they said they'd love to try. Well, I know Loch Ewe because I've sailed in there a couple of times on board Royal Navy ships that I've served in, especially during NATO exercises over the years. In fact, there's still a NATO fueling jetty there in the bay. Now, for the life of me, I could not recall a sinking, but after some research, I discovered that Mrs. Gill's uncle, Mr. John William King, was on board the SS William H Welsh, an American Liberty ship, which did in fact sink in 1944, and that was near to Loch Ewe. Now, during the Second World War, there was a huge requirement for cargo vessels, and the United States mass-produced these 7,000-ton, 450-feet-long, low-cost constructed vessels. They were used to resupply Britain and were also used on the Russian convoys to supply Russia. Almost 3,000 were built during the Second World War in 18 American shipyards, and, incredibly, the mean time for construction was under 60 days from laying the keel to launch. Scottish Government, take note, this is a wee bit better than 8 years it's taken for a ferry to be built from Port Glasgow, but I'm not going there. It was actually President Franklin D. Roosevelt who launched the first of these vessels, the SS Patrick Henry, and in his speech at the launch ceremony, FDR cited Patrick Henry's 1775 speech that finished, "Give me liberty or give me death." Roosevelt said that this new class of ship would bring liberty to Europe, which gave rise to the name Liberty Ship. Returning to Mrs. Gill's uncle, John King, he was on board the SS William H Welsh, which was named after a famous American medical pioneer, on the fateful night of 26 February 1944. The ship, which was part of a convoy EN 350, was on its way from London to New York and was calling into Loch Ewe en route. By the time she reached the entrance to the loch, a severe storm had blown up, and without cargo and sitting very high out of the water, she was blown away from the entrance to the loch and down onto a reef called Eilean Ferramor. She hit the reef at 4:20 a.m. and stuck fast. The ferocious storm now did its worst, and the ship eventually broke up, throwing the 74 crewmen into the stormy, icy water. Rescuers on the shore had battled their way across a boggy moor and lit a large fire on the beach. They could only peer into the swirling snow and at the churning sea, looking on as the men were swept to their death onto the rocks and onto the shore. Out of a crew of 74, only 12 survived, and John King was one of those lucky survivors. Amongst the rescuers were some local women from nearby cottages, and they had brought their few possessions such as quilt covers and any sparse wartime food supplies they'd had to the beach. They wrapped the oil-soaked sailors in their blankets to keep them warm. The 12 survivors were eventually taken to the Gairloch Hotel, which was then commandeered as a military hospital, where they were given appropriate medical attention before being repatriated to America. One of those local ladies who assisted the stricken sailors was a mother of a local man named John Murdo, who helped build the memorial cairn opposite the sinking of the William H Welsh. And his cottage is about a mile from the memorial site, and I took Mr. and Mrs. Gill to see it. We called in, but sadly he was away. His 2 daughters, however, were around, Annetta and Marina, and it was great to meet up with them and for Margie Gill to be able to personally thank them for what their grandmother had done for Margie's Uncle John. And here was I, with Margie Gill and her husband John, near to the spot where her Uncle John King had come ashore and within sight of the Shipwreck Island. It was a very touching moment, and I was honoured to be sharing this with them. As it happens, my research had taken me to the Gairloch Museum and the Arctic Convoy Museum, both of which I've mentioned in previous podcasts, but this time my visit would include some guests with a direct link to local seafaring activities. At the Arctic Convoy Museum, we met a gentleman named Bruce Hudson, a volunteer who looks after veteran records, and who was kind enough to tell us a bit more about the ship and its survivors.
Although we are the Arctic Convoy Museum, William H Welsh and the loss of her in February of 1944 is very much part of local history, and therefore we have a record of it and we try to perpetuate its memory. What we know is that on that very stormy night of the 26th of February 1944, the ship, which was in ballast, but water ballast, making her very unstable, and the storm drove the ship onto the uninhabited island just off the north coast of the Loch entrance, where she grounded, and under the fury of the storm eventually broke into two sections. And the crew members, 74 of them, were either thrown into the sea or actually thrown under the force of the waves onto the shoreline. Many drowned at that point in time, and many were killed by the force of being thrown ashore. Those that survived, 12 of them eventually, managed to overcome those dangers and also the danger from exposure because of that weather system that was applying, until the rescuers eventually got their way across open countryside to the shoreline and started the action to recover them to the Gairloch Hospital.
I saw some photographs you showed me of the Remembrance Service, where people have actually gone to the newly built then, memorial opposite the island where the ship went down. And it's amazing that even a helicopter came and dropped a wreath into the water. I have to say, as an ex-serviceman myself, it gives me great heart that, you've remembered these folk, as they say, the sun will never go down on these individuals. So thank you very much indeed. And final thoughts on meeting Mrs. Gill today?
It was excellent to meet the family of a veteran. One of the big satisfying aspects of the task here is meeting families and being able to provide them with further background information, etc. And quite a high percentage of our visitors do have family connections with veterans. Primarily Arctic, of course, but because of the nature of William H Welsh's loss, we very much remain involved with that ship.
I then asked Bruce, now realising that John King was still alive, whether he would need his address. And this is what he said.
Yes, wherever we have date of birth and a postal address for our Arctic veterans, we send them out birthday cards and Christmas cards, and we would like to extend that to John King, who's now resident in the States.
And that was Bruce Hudson, the Arctic Convoy Museum volunteer who looks after Veterans Affairs. And thank you so much, Bruce, for your contribution to this podcast. And what a lovely thought, sending birthday and Christmas cards. Thank you. Well, with Bruce that day was a lovely elderly gentleman named Roy Macintyre, who is heavily involved in the Gairloch Museum as it happens. Well, Roy's now around 90 years old and was about 10 years old and living in Altbea when the tragedy occurred. And Roy has kindly agreed to share his memories of that tragic day in 1944.
My name is Roy Macintyre. I was born in Gairloch. I'm now in my 90th year, but when the SS William Welsh was sunk, I was a boy of 9 years old, and I remember the day, and I remember the survivors being in the Gairloch Hotel, which was a military hospital at the time.
And you were only 10 years old,
yes.
Roy. And what was your father doing?
My father had the shop in the village, and these survivors used to come down and, when they were convalescing, they came down and visited the shop and chatted with him. And he'd been an old soldier in the First World War, so he was very interested in their stories, and they yarned away about their exploits. Yeah.
There was one sailor in particular that you were interested in because he was injured when he was brought ashore. How did that happen?
This sailor, the story was that he was impaled to a lump of timber, and that's what saved his life. He was taken ashore and he had a very bad injury on his hand, and he used to tell us about his injury, and I think showed it to my father as a little boy. I wasn't allowed to have a close look, but reputedly he had a hole in his hand, and that fascinated me. But
I can imagine you as a young lad looking over the banister, trying to get a wee peek
that's
at
right. Yes,
what was going on there. Yes. And how long did the American sailors, stay in Altbea?
And I imagine it was just about maybe a couple of weeks, and then once their convalescence was over, they were moved to somewhere.
And where were they convalescing?
In the Gairloch Hotel, which was a military hospital.
At the time, wow. That is amazing. And over the years, you've obviously kept in touch with the story.
Well, I've been involved in the area, as I was a civil engineer, and have got involved in building the NATO base at Altbea in later years. And then I had a little business in Gairloch before I retired. And in latter years, I've been very involved in the Gairloch Museum, the same as Bruce has been involved in the Russian convoy. So there are these two museums now which both have artefacts from the exploits of the Second World War.
I then asked Roy about John Murdo Mackenzie, whose mother was one of several women who took blankets down to the shore.
John was slightly a bit older than me, but he was a young fellow, and he assisted with the rescue, as did many of the other crofters. I think they brought blankets and boiling water and all sorts of things to help them, because the weather was atrocious at the time.
And they'd be covered in oil, of course.
And they would be covered in oil, yes. No, it was a miracle that they got ashore when you saw the conditions.
Yeah. Amazing stories of these folk in the croft houses, the wee cottages, who had nothing effectively, using their blankets and beds even to wrap these oil-covered men.
Absolutely, yes.
And you're now involved in the Gairloch Museum, is that right?
Yes. We've had a refurbished museum in an old nuclear bunker, which is refurbished, and now has had a great success as a museum. Yeah.
Well, thank you to Bruce from the Arctic Convoy Museum and Roy from the Gairloch Museum. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that tragic day. Can I also thank James Brown, the manager of the Arctic Convoy Museum, for facilitating that day and for allowing Margie and John Gill to come in, meet the folk and have a good chat and find out a lot more about their uncle John King. Well, a sad story of the sinking of the W.H. Welsh, but a good news ending in that Margie and John Gill were able to visit the site and take back to their uncle John King, the last survivor of the ship and now 99 years old, the news that they had visited the area and spoke to the granddaughters of the lady that helped save him that fateful night 80 years ago. Before they left, I asked for their take on their visit to Scotland.
Well, it's been wonderful. We've had wonderful weather, of course, but it's so beautiful. I think beyond our imagination, the beauty of the Scotland mountains and being up here has just been wonderful. And the history, we love history, and so that's been amazing too.
The beauty of the landscape, even though you hear it's beautiful, to actually be there and see it, and the lakes and the mountains, just the whole topography is just fabulous.
Of Scotland. Is this the first time in Scotland?
No, we've been here once before, but this is the first time in this area.
In this area, yeah. And of course, while we were travelling north, you just happened to mention to me that you might have an uncle who was a fascinating man who is still with us and yet was involved in the sinking of a ship during the Second World War. Can you just tell me a bit about that?
Sure. So my uncle was on the William Welsh, and we knew that he was one of 12 survivors in a shipwreck off the coast of Scotland, but nobody in the family had ever been there. We wanted to bring him back, but he's 99 years old. He's the last survivor of the 12 survivors from the shipwreck. And it was so emotional to go there and see where his shipwreck, to see what happened to him and how he had to make his way and help his fellow Navy men to get to the ones who survived to be safe, and how it's also very touching to learn the stories about how the people of Scotland helped these men, especially the women, and protected them and saved their lives.
Yeah. And actually see his picture in the museum.
That was extraordinary, wasn't it? I mean, we were in the museum and there was a video playing which talked about the historical event, and all of a sudden Margie leapt forward and said, "That's him." We actually saw a picture of him. And afterwards, of course, at the Arctic Convoy Museum, not only would we see a picture of him, then underneath the picture, what did you find there?
there was a letter that he had written. I think it was at the second museum, at the Arctic Convoy. Yes,
Museum.
and he had written a letter because when they put the monument up, they'd invited him over in 2014, and he wrote a letter saying he couldn't come, but that he knew how lucky he was to survive. He thanked the people, and it just really moved us to tears.
Yeah, I mean, that was something else, John. I have to say, when you said, oh, heavens, this is a letter, I mean, there was a lump in my throat as well, and I think everybody who was around you stood back in awe. In fact, a couple of ladies just visiting were saying, good Lord, is that actually your relative? So generally in Scotland, what do you think, John? Would you recommend it to anybody out there who wants to come to Scotland?
Oh, absolutely. It's beautiful. Of course, I've got Scottish background in my family, so I have special interest in it, but it's just beautiful. The people are as nice as you could find anywhere.
Yes.
And if you're interested in history, boy, there's history.
Yeah, absolutely. What about yourself?
Oh, yes, it's been wonderful. In fact, we thought we would do this, and maybe this is our last trip to the UK, but I think we'll come back to Scotland. It's just so beautiful. It just gets in your soul, and the nature. It's really all about nature and history, and it's not commercial at all, which we love, and we've had the best guide ever.
Well, I can't disagree with that, Margie and Sean. Well, thank you so much. Listen, guys, it's been lovely having you with me. And can I say safe travels and safe flight down to London, then on to America. So all the very best. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. We'll see you in America.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Well, thank you to Margie and John. What a lovely couple. And thank you both for allowing me to share this story of your uncle with all my listeners. Well, that's it, folks, for 2024, and what a great year it's been, with so many of you either touring with me or meeting me in Scotland, or just dropping me a line to let me know how much you're enjoying the podcasts. I can't mention everyone who toured with me, but I wish to say hi to the following. Tony and Anne Gilliana from Australia, it was a blast. Sarah Wren with Rich, Betty and Dan, we covered so much ground on our 12-day tour, which was a lovely family event. Of course, Jim and Linda Wood, who I mentioned earlier. And Mary Ann and Jeff Edwards, who enjoyed a tour of Edinburgh. And thank you, Mary Ann, for your book. Mary Ann is the author of the McClung Detective series. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I will recommend it to the world. There you go, I have just recommended it to the world. Lorna Bratton Cooper with Paula, what fun to travel with you to the north of Scotland and my own Mackay country. Thank you. Barbara and Chris, our tour around the Highlands was super, and I was delighted to help you find your ancestors in the Inverness area. I had Jennifer and Richard Lofgren in Edinburgh in October, and as I found out, Richard and I are brothers in arms. Richard is in the US Navy, and I was in the Royal Navy. And I could tell before we were introduced that I was in the presence of greatness, with his upright bearing, immaculate dress, and razor-sharp haircut. I salute you, sir, and enjoyed you and Jennifer's company. I was up in the Torridon Mountains with Eliana and Jelks Cabanis, and we all had a good laugh at the Highland Coo poem. And it was also great to meet up with Weldon and Jennifer Egan, and I hope to see you back again in Scotland soon. It is amazing how time flies, especially when you're enjoying yourself, and it's been great fun sharing Scotland with all my guests in 2024. In my next podcast, I'll be taking you on a tour of the city of Glasgow. It's much larger but much younger than Edinburgh, you might be surprised to hear, so I look forward to telling you all about that. And thank you so much to those of you who have bought me a coffee. And if you wish to contribute in a small way to these podcasts, then you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Unique Scotland. And all contributions are much appreciated. But please do share these Unique Scotland podcasts with friends and family, and that's even better. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you all listening today, and I would now like to wish you all a very happy and wonderful 2025. And for those who may be interested, I intend to visit America in 2025. Now that's to attend Tartan Week on the 5th of April, and that's in New York. So I'm going to be around between the 3rd and the 10th of April in New York, and if any of you are about, let me know. It'd be great to meet up. Well, it just remains for me to sign off in my traditional Scottish fashion, and it's appropriate to raise a glass with a wee dram of my favourite Highland Park whisky to welcome in the new year. And to you, dear friends, wherever you are in the world, Slán Java.
Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance in Auld Lang Syne. For Auld Lang Syne, my dear, for Auld Lang Syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for Auld Lang Syne.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.